So now let's move to our first subtopic, our first molecule, which are carbohydrates. Now, carbohydrates, we've been studying about them since our lower secondary classes, and we know that carbohydrates are one of the energy sources for our body. हम इनको consume करते हैं and इनकी consumption क्यों इतनी important है? Because carbohydrates can be oxidized and they can be used to release energy. Now, why do carbohydrates are a source of energy and how do they release energy? We'll come to that in a while. But let's first understand the classification of carbohydrates. Okay. Now, first and foremost, carbohydrates में कौन-कौन से elements होते हैं? So, carbohydrates comprise of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Okay. And they are made up of these three elements. Now, why are they named carbohydrates? So basically, when we see any carbohydrate and we look at their general formula, we realize that the hydrogen and the oxygen, these two atoms, like the atoms of hydrogen and the atoms of oxygen, they are present in a 2:1 ratio. By that I mean that for every two hydrogen atoms, there is one oxygen atom present. So we can say that, for example, let's take a very simple example of glucose, which is C6H12O6. So if I write its empirical formula, or if I write a simplified formula of glucose, it would basically be CH2O, right? Because this would be this, and this, correct? So what do I observe is that basically, if I express the formula of carbohydrates like this, and now if I multiply, if I put X as any number of atoms, like over here 6, and I place H2O. So if I had 6 carbons and I say that there are 6 water molecules joining together to form them, so this would give me C6H12O6, which is the formula of glucose. Now, when I said that water molecules are joining with carbon, carbohydrates and water molecules join together nahi hote. But in a very ancient times, it was believed when science had not progressed so much that carbohydrates are basically hydrates of carbon. And therefore, chemists came up with this formula or this expression that C6H2O bracket Y is basically why that carbohydrates have this formula. So is this clear? Any questions about it? Because hydrogen and oxygen are present in a ratio of 2:1, that is why it is said that the general formula of carbohydrates is this. Now, when we talk about the classification or the division or the grouping of carbohydrates, so we have three main categories, three main groups of carbohydrates, which are monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides. So let's understand what each branch means. Now, mono, we all know, means one. Di, we know it means two. Poly, we know that it means many. Now we've understood the first part of all these words. Now, what is a saccharide? What do we mean by saccharide? So, saccharide is basically sugar. Sugar is called a saccharide or something sweet. That is where the word saccharide comes from. That is what the word saccharide means. It means sugar or it means a sweet molecule. Now, if now we look at these words, monosaccharide, disaccharide, and polysaccharide, monosaccharide means made up of one sugar. Disaccharide means made up of two sugars. And polysaccharide means made up of many sugars. Okay, that is basically a very simple understanding of all these three categories. Now, let's understand these three branches and let's see what elements and compounds and molecules make up these. So now when we talk about monosaccharides, there are three types of monosaccharides, ठीक है जी? And they are hexoses, pentoses, and trioses. There is further classification in monosaccharides. हमने पहली classification क्या पढ़ी? Carbohydrates की classification पढ़ी. That carbohydrates are classified into three categories, which are monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides. And now when we are studying monosaccharides, we understand that monosaccharides further have a classification. And they are classified into hexoses, pentoses, and trioses. Now, what does hexoses, pentoses, and trioses mean? Now, when we talk about hexoses, and we say that these numbers or these names basically tell us the number of carbon atoms present in the sugar. Now, carbon, we know that we've studied organic chemistry in our O levels, and we know that carbon, whenever it's present, it is basically making up organic molecules, right? Except when it's present in carbon dioxide and oxides of carbon. Otherwise, when it's present in with hydrogen and oxygen, it is making what? It is making organic compounds. So carbon is basically a source of organic compounds. It is present in all organic compounds barring carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide. Now, carbon is a main component of all the biological molecules that we're studying. Why? Because हमारी body में कोई भी चीज अगर exist कर रही है तो वो एक organic molecule होगा. Majority of them are organic molecules. So now, how many carbon atoms are present in hexoses? So in hexoses, there are 6 carbon atoms present. जैसे hexagon में there are 6 points, there are 6 sides. उसी तरह से hexoses are those monosaccharides, that sugar which actually has 6 carbon atoms present inside it. Now when we talk about pentoses, pentoses have 5 carbon atoms present inside them. And then for trioses, there are 3 carbon atoms present in trioses. Now, as far as our syllabus is concerned, we have to only deal with pentoses and hexoses. Now, there are 3 hexoses: glucose, fructose, and galactose. Now, हमारे पास glucose, fructose, and galactose, they have 6 carbon atoms, right? And we studied that the general formula of carbohydrates is what? It is basically CxH2OY. Now, when I talk about monosaccharides, so the general formula or the formula which monosaccharides have is what? Sorry, hexoses. और hexoses में हमारे पास जो monosaccharides होता है उनके पास उनका general formula क्या होता है? It is basically C X H2X OX, correct? So we can say that this is what? This is basically CH2O. So all monosaccharides have a general formula of CH2O. Now, if I start placing the carbon atoms, so for hexoses, for all of my hexoses, I would say that how many carbon atoms are present? There are 6 carbon atoms are present. So if there are 6 carbon atoms present, how many hydrogen would be present? There would be 12 hydrogen present. And how many oxygen atoms? There would be 6 oxygen atoms. So for hexoses, my formula would be C6H12O6. Now, coming to pentoses. Now in pentoses, I have 5 carbon atoms. So this would mean C5H10O5. But the catch over here is that this is the formula for ribose. Why? Because pentoses में हमारे पास दो तरह की pentose sugars होती हैं, which are what? Which are ribose and deoxyribose. Now, as the name suggests, deoxyribose में से एक oxygen atom absent होता है. It has one oxygen atom less than the ribose, and we say that it has lost one oxygen atom. तो वो deoxygen, जैसे हम कहते हैं ना oxygenated blood and deoxygenated blood, and the oxygen content of deoxygenated blood is less than the oxygen content of oxygenated blood. Similarly, because there is one oxygen atom less in deoxyribose, we say that it is a deoxygenated form of ribose. Why? Because it has one oxygen atom less. So for deoxyribose, our formula would be what? It would be C5H10 and O4. This is your deoxyribose. ठीक है जी. अच्छा, any questions so far? Anything that you guys want to ask? Okay. Now when we come to disaccharides, what happens is that two monosaccharides, they combine together to form a sugar, which is basically they combine together. For example, I have one sugar and then I have this sugar, and they combine together through a covalent bond, and that molecule which is made up of two units, which is made up of two monosaccharides, that is basically a disaccharide. Okay, and what happens is that one water molecule is lost, and that therefore condensation occurs. Yani ke when one monosaccharide combines with another monosaccharide, it forms a disaccharide, and in that process, one water molecule is lost. And this thing, because two things are combining together, we say that this is a condensation reaction. Why? Because two things are coming together to form a new molecule, and one small molecule is being lost. So that is a condensation reaction when two subunits join together to form a larger unit, and a smaller unit is lost as a result of it. That type of addition or that type of combination, that type of amalgamation is called a condensation reaction. And we will study and the mechanism and the doings of a condensation reaction in detail in just a while. Now, the disaccharides that we have to study for our syllabus are basically मेजरली जो हमें पढ़नी है वो हमें सबसे इम्पोर्टेंट जो पढ़नी है हमारे लिए वो है सुक्रोज. ठीक है, then the others are maltose, then we have lactose and cell bios. Okay, and we'll understand what two sugars are coming together and forming these disaccharides. And when we talk about polysaccharides are made up of many. तो अच्छा, यहाँ पर in disaccharides it is possible कि हमारे पास जो units हैं वो जो सब यूनिट्स हैं, जो स्मॉलर यूनिट्स हैं या जो मोनोसैकेराइड्स हैं वो डिफरेंट हो. फॉर एग्जांपल व्हेन आई टॉक अबाउट sucrose is formed when a glucose and a fructose molecule, these two monosaccharides combine together, lose one water molecule, and that gives us a sucrose molecule. But for polysaccharides, because it's poly and it's becoming from saccharides, so it is a polymer. Now its repeat units should be same. So a polymer, because we just understood, is made up of the same repeat units. So it has to be made from a similar type of monomer. So now the three polysaccharides which we have to study for our syllabus are your glycogen, starch, and cellulose. And in a while, I'll tell you that what monomers are forming these polysaccharides. But that is basically a general overview, a general classification of carbohydrates. Any questions so far? Or we move forward? Anything you guys want to ask Khuda, Muskan, Hajra? Any questions? Now, moving forward, let's understand, and this is a very important concept, so I want you guys to be with me. Okay, now glucose हमारे पास एक बहुत अहम molecule होता है. Why? Because we know that glucose is being formed as a result of photosynthesis. We know that glucose is required by our body for energy purposes. सही है? So glucose is a very important molecule, and glucose, even for your from your exam point of view, is very important, and both the types of glucose. So before we talk about glucose, let me show you the structure of glucose. So this is how glucose looks like. So let's see. Glucose is a carbohydrate, and carbohydrates we said are made up of carbon, oxygen and hydrogen. उनमें सिर्फ ये तीन elements, ये तीन चीजें पाई जाती हैं, carbon, oxygen and hydrogen. So in this entire structure, this is a straight chain structure of glucose. And you guys have studied chemistry. So for all of you, you know that this is a straight chain. Why? Because यहाँ पर कोई branching नहीं हुई हुई, यहाँ पर किसी किस्म की क्या कहते हैं, there is no branching and there is no ring structure or there is no overlap. It's a straight chain structure. So this is how a straight chain structure of glucose looks like. Now, it's made up of carbon, hydrogen and oxygen. So yeah, this is how it appears. But the thing is that glucose basically this is a straight chain structure, but this is not a stable structure. Glucose is form में अपनी straight chain form में stable नहीं होती है. It is not stabilized. So to stabilize itself, it has to organize or it has to form a certain orientation which would be stable for it. And what happens is that this fifth carbon, now if I number these carbons for you, this is carbon 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6. ठीक है? Now, this fifth carbon would go and form, from here it would actually, this would go and it would form a bond with this carbon. और एक ring like structure, because ये यहाँ से इसके साथ bond create कर रही है, so एक ring like structure create हो जाएगा, ठीक है? And जो sixth carbon है, जिसको I can also express it as CH2OH, ये जो पूरा 6th carbon वाला portion है, this portion would lie outside the ring. So what we have learned so far that glucose का ये हमारे पास एक straight chain structure होता है, but this straight chain structure is not a stable structure. So to stabilize itself, glucose undergoes it basically organizes itself in a ring structure, which is a relatively more stable structure. और हमारे पास ग्लूकोज इसी तरह से ring structures में ही abundantly पाई जाती है. In a ring structure, the fifth carbon bonds with the first carbon, forming a ring-like bond, and the sixth carbon is basically lying outside the ring. Now, ये जब organize होती है, यानी जब when the straight chain glucose is organizing itself in a ring form, two types of rings are created. And we say that one of those rings is an alpha glucose ring, and the other type of the ring is a beta glucose thing, a beta glucose ring. ठीक है? Now, what are the differences between alpha glucose and beta glucose? So मैं इन दोनों के structures अभी आप लोगों के साथ draw करती हूँ. Pardon my drawing, I'm just giving you a disclaimer, I'm very bad at drawing structures वैसे. But I'll be drawing the structures for both of them, and then you guys will tell me कि आपको क्या similarities और क्या differences नजर आ रहे हैं. Okay? So, now, अच्छा जी. Basically, let me draw these dots. So, जो ये points हैं, each point represents a carbon atom. ठीक है? Now, let me number these carbon atoms. So, this is बल्कि मैं अंदर की तरफ label कर देती हूँ. This is carbon 1, carbon 2, carbon 3, carbon 4, carbon 5. Now, this is a ring. A complete ring structure form हो गया. ठीक है? And I said that our carbon number 6 would be lying out this entire thing, CH2OH. It would be lying outside तो वो इस तरह से बाहर की तरफ होगा, CH2OH। नाउ हमारे पास, लेट्स कंप्लीट द रिमेनिंग स्ट्रक्चर। सो दिस कार्बन, now this is the structure of an alpha glucose. सही है? And what can you observe in the structure? Let's just quickly go over it. So this carbon, हर carbon की valency हमें पता है that every carbon atom can form 4 bonds at a time. So if we look at this carbon atom, ये जो है हमारे पास, at one time it is bonded to a hydrogen, and it is bonded to this OH, which is a hydroxyl group. And then over here, it's bonded to an oxygen, and then it is bonded to carbon number 2. So at one time, every carbon atom has to satisfy its valency, which is basically a tetravalency. Tetra का मतलब होता है 4. And हमारे पास carbon, because it has a valency that it would form, it has a nature of forming 4 covalent bonds. So we call carbon a tetravalent species. Why? Because it forms 4 covalent bonds at a time. ठीक है जी? Now हमारे पास ये किस चीज का स्ट्रक्चर हो गया? ये हमारे पास स्ट्रक्चर हो गया alpha glucose का. Now let me draw a structure of beta glucose, and then you guys tell me what is the difference between those two. ठीक है जी? Okay, so basically over here I have drawn an almost identical structure to an alpha glucose. ठीक है? इसके जितने ends थे उतने ही ends इसमें भी होंगे. Now, what's the catch? Let me draw it and you tell me कि आपको क्या difference नजर आ रहा है. Okay, now हमारे पास कार्बन 5 है और ये CH2OH जो हमारे पास 6 कार्बन है वो आउटसाइड लाई कर रहा है. Now, if you look at both these structures of an alpha glucose and of a beta glucose, can you tell me what difference can you observe, a noticeable difference that you can see? Any suggestions? Any guesses? Position of hydroxyl group. Okay. And on the carbon number 1, so if you notice, the only difference that you can observe, just a second, the only difference that you can observe over here is basically that over here, this hydroxyl group is pointing downwards, and over here, this hydroxyl group is pointing upwards. So the only difference between an alpha glucose and a beta glucose is what? It is the position of the OH group on carbon number 1. Now, how did I remember कि इसकी placement किस तरह से होगी? So alpha से मैंने याद किया था अल्फा में A आता है. So इसका जो hydroxyl group of carbon number 1 होगा, that would be pointing below. And in beta, because beta starts with a B, इसका जो hydroxyl group होगा, that would be pointing above. So from A, B और B A करके मैंने याद किया हुआ था कि अगर alpha है, तो alpha starts with an A, तो इसका जो hydroxyl group होगा, that would be below. And beta, because it's starting with a B, इसका जो हाइड्रोक्सिल ग्रुप होगा वो अबव होगा. So that is the only difference between an alpha glucose and a beta glucose, which is the placement of the OH group. So is this clear? The ring structure and the two types of alpha glucose and beta, the two types of glucose which are alpha and beta. आपको ये स्ट्रक्चर याद रखना है, बिकॉज अभी जब हम लोग कंडेंसेशन पढ़ रहे होंगे एंड फॉर्मेशन ऑफ डाइसैकेराइड्स पढ़ रहे होंगे, सो इसमें यू रियलाइज दैट यू हैव टू समटाइम्स आपके पास होता क्या है, आपके पास एक डाइसैकेराइड आ जाता है और आपसे एमसीक्यू में पूछते हैं कि आप बताएं कि जो ये हमारे पास डाइसैकेराइड है इसके जो मोनोमर्स हैं वो कौन सी टाइप ऑफ ग्लूकोज है. सो उसमें द पोजिशन of the alpha of the hydroxyl group of the OH group would tell you कि आपके पास कौन सा monomer, was it a beta glucose monomer or was it an alpha glucose monomer? You have to identify that. Sometimes you have to draw the condensation reaction and show the formation of fructose or the formation of maltose. तो उसमें आपका एक मार्क करेक्ट ड्राइंग ऑफ द स्ट्रक्चर के लिए होता है. अगर आपने पूरी कंडेंसेशन रिएक्शन सही बना दी बट यू डिड नॉट फॉर्म द करेक्ट रिंग स्ट्रक्चर ऑफ एन अल्फा ग्लूकोज, इंस्टेड ऑफ मेकिंग एन अल्फा ग्लूकोज आपने जल्दी में एक बीटा ग्लूकोज क्रिएट कर दी, सो यू विल लूज योर मार्क्स ओवर देयर. So this is a very important thing in this chapter, in this subtopic. So I really want कि आप लोग आज ऐसा करना कि once the class is over, draw the structures of an alpha glucose and a beta glucose by yourself. Okay. Now, this is the last topic for our day, which is disaccharides condensation. And what is basically happening over here? We have to study these three, and specifically ये आपके सबसे ज़्यादा most tested होते हैं. सही है? These are the most tested in your exams. आपका maltose and our sucrose. So now, maltose is formed when two alpha glucose come together. So let's draw, or let's just copy paste alpha glucose from here only. Now, this is one alpha glucose and this is another alpha glucose. Now I have two alpha glucose monomers with me. Now what happens is कि carbon number 1 का जो OH है और carbon number 4 जो दूसरे alpha glucose है, इनका जो OH है वो आपस में एक बॉन्ड फॉर्म करते हैं, कनेक्ट करते हैं इन दोनों अल्फा ग्लूकोज को टू फॉर्म माल्टोज. और वो कुछ इस तरह से होता है दैट एज आई मेंशन्ड दैट व्हेनेवर टू units join together to form a larger unit and a small unit or a small molecule of water is lost, that type of a reaction is a condensation reaction. हमारे पास जब भी क्या कहते हैं एनाबॉलिक रिएक्शन होता है, यानी कि हमारे पास two small units, two small molecules are joining together to form a larger molecule, that type of a reaction is called a condensation reaction. Now, हमारे पास होता क्या है कि हमारे पास this hydrogen, ठीक है, हमारे पास होगा क्या कि हमारे पास इस तरह से ये मॉलिक्यूल ऑफ वाटर विल बी लॉस्ट. ठीक है, ये हमारे पास चीज रिमूव हो जाएगी, लॉस्ट हो जाएगी और हमारे पास क्या बचेगा? हमारे पास इस कार्बन का ये जो स्पीशी है, लेट मी ड्रॉ इट फॉर यू, बल्कि एक सेकेंड. व्हाट वुड हैपन इज दैट दिस थिंग would be lost as water. Now, इस हाइड्रोजन के पास, हाइड्रोजन की वैलेंसी क्या होती है? हाइड्रोजन को दो बॉन्ड्स फॉर्म करने होते हैं, तो हाइड्रोजन का एक बॉन्ड तो कार्बन के साथ फॉर्म्ड है, लेकिन इसका जो हाइड्रोजन के साथ बॉन्ड फॉर्म था वो तो हमने रिमूव कर दिया, हाइड्रोजन वो तो लूज हो गया वाटर में, तो इसकी ये वैलेंसी खाली है. ठीक है, एंड हमारे पास कार्बन को एक वक्त में चार बॉन्ड्स बनाने होते हैं, तो इसने एक बॉन्ड किसके साथ बनाया हुआ है? हाइड्रोजन के साथ. एक इसने कार्बन 5 के साथ बॉन्ड बनाया हुआ है, एक इसने बॉन्ड कार्बन 3 के साथ बनाया हुआ है, लेकिन इसका फोर्थ बॉन्ड इनकम्प्लीट है. तो ये ऑक्सीजन का ये वाला बॉन्ड इनकम्प्लीट है, कार्बन का ये वाला बॉन्ड इनकम्प्लीट है. तो बिकॉज दोनों को बॉन्ड फॉर्म करना है, तो हमारे पास यहां पर एक बॉन्ड फॉर्म हो जाएगा. Basically, the oxygen and the carbon would form a bond once the water molecule is removed, and this bond is basically called a glycosidic bond. And because it is made between the carbon number 1 of one alpha glucose and the carbon number 4 of the other alpha glucose, तो हम specify कर देते हैं कि कौन से दो carbons involved थे या कौन से दो carbons मिलकर glycosidic bond बना रहे हैं. So because carbon 1 and carbon 4 are forming this glycosidic bond, this connecting linkage between these two alpha glucose, we call this bond alpha 1,4 glycosidic bond. ठीक है? Any questions so far? Anything that you couldn't understand? Any queries? Okay, so this is basically formation of maltose. And my pass maltose. Let me just clearly draw it for you guys as well, quickly. So this initially was an OH and this was an OH. So what happens is that water molecule is lost. किस तरह से? इस तरह से, और हमारे पास क्या फिर बनता है? हमारे पास एक maltose बन जाता है. And that is something like this. तो ये हमारे पास जो ऑक्सीजन एटम लेफ्ट ओवर था वो आपस में कनेक्ट कर रहा होता है, ऑक्सीजन कार्बन 4 के साथ बॉन्ड क्रिएट कर रहा होता है, एंड दिस इज अ alpha 1,4 glycosidic bond, and this is your maltose basically. तो इस तरह से हमारे पास maltose फॉर्म हो रही है. नाउ वन थिंग दैट यू शुड अप्रिशिएट इज कि हमारे पास दोनों जो हाइड्रोक्सिल ग्रुप्स हैं, जो हमारे पास दोनों हाइड्रोक्सिल्स हैं, ये एक ही प्लेन पर है, एक ही लेवल पर है. एंड इट इज वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट कि हमारे पास जो उनका प्लेन है जिसपे वो एग्जिस्ट कर रहे हैं वो सेम हो, क्योंकि अगर वो ऊपर नीचे होते हैं, फॉर एग्जाम्पल द क्वेश्चन कुड कम कि हमारे पास दोनों कार्बन 1 और कार्बन 1 आकर अगर बॉन्ड कर रहे हैं तो क्या वो फॉर्म हो सकता है? बिल्कुल हो सकता है. बट हमारे पास जो ओरिएंटेशन है वो हमेशा इसी तरह से होगी कि हमारे पास एक तरफ कार्बन 1 आ रहा होगा और दूसरी तरफ कार्बन 4 आ रहा होगा. सो अगर मैं इसको फ्लिप कर दूं और इफ आई फ्लिप दिस एंड आई ब्रिंग इट ओवर हियर एंड आई सेंड इट ओवर हियर, तब भी हमारे पास जो बॉन्ड बन रहा होगा वो 1,4 ग्लाइकोसिडिक बॉन्ड ही बन रहा होगा. So it's the glycosidic bond is being formed between the carbon 1 of one glucose and the carbon 4 of another glucose. ठीक है?